Good afternoon, class. I'm going to pick up where we left off today. This morning we were talking about some of the historical developments within the world region of North America that have given the world region of North America some of its distinctive human geography. And so I'm going to click through some of these early slides so we don't spend too much time spinning our wheels. But we did talk a little bit about how there are some fairly dramatic differences of cultural values and cultural practices, cultural institutions that divide the European immigrants that by and large make up much of the human geography of North America today, as compared to the Native American and First Nation people that made up the human geography of North America, say 500 years ago. And so there's an important distinction to make there. We think of the human geography of North America today on almost exclusively European terms, but of course the original human geography of this world region was quite dramatically different and largely referred to horticultural and pastoral nomadic peoples that inhabited North America prior to the arrival of Europeans some 400 or so years ago. We talked in class about some of the distinctive subregions. I'll just quickly breeze through there. And we left off talking a little bit about how the frontier, or the process of westward migration and westward expansion across North America, is a fitting microcosm. It doesn't capture all of the human geography by any means. No small focal point really could capture the extensive and complicated human geography of North America. But we could do far worse than to choose the frontier experience as being one of the more defining and important chapters in the human history of North America over the past 400 or so years. So we talked a little bit about this in class. I left off talking about manifest destiny, and I believe in class I described it as something of a secular theology of North America, in the sense that this idea of manifest destiny suggests a certain inevitability, that there's a certain almost blessing or entitlement of European Americans to move all the way across the North American continent, to subdue it, to use its resources, to inhabit it, to claim it as the property of European Americans. And the idea of manifest destiny, as it was introduced to the United States in the mid-19th century, was one that very much was infused with a spirituality and a religious element. Although there's a close tie between the policy, hopes, and dreams of the United States, and to a lesser extent Canada, of this inevitable march westward. And so I refer to it as something of a secular religious creed. You know, it doesn't exactly make sense, but something that the state used as sort of a spiritual guiding principle. So to help us understand this perhaps with a little bit greater degree of focus, a little higher resolution, we benefit from being introduced to this gentleman, Frederick Jackson Turner. I'm assuming that most of you haven't been introduced to him. In some ways, as far as historians go, he's something of a rock star, but when you think of rock star historians, I guess it's not surprising that they could still largely be unknown. But Frederick Jackson Turner, for a few decades, really captured the imagination and the attention of a lot of Americans, and probably even some Canadians, based on a thesis or essay that he wrote talking about the significance of the frontier in the history of North America, and specifically in the case of the United States. In 1893, he wrote this. It was important. That date is important because he presented it at the World's Fair in Chicago. I can't remember if that was actually in 1893 or 1894. It was right in there. This is the same World's Fair, by the way, that the recent novel, The Devil in the White City, was written. One of the more important expos. And the World's Fair was very much like a fair. It was the idea, the world coming together to share some of the most important breakthroughs in science, technology, agriculture, cultural development, music, drama, you name it. It was essentially when developed countries of the world got together and bragged to one another about their accomplishments. And I believe they happened every 4 years. I think I have that correctly. Anyway, in 1893, Turner had produced a pretty interesting piece of scholarship that served pretty well in representing the United States at the World's Fair in Chicago in the early 1890s. And essentially what he said was the United States, as of the census of 1890, meaning reading the data of settlement patterns and population densities in the American West, it could no longer be said that the United States possessed a wide open frontier of westward expansion. Now, at a closer look, we know, well, duh, of course not, because the plains had always been essentially inhabited by native tribes. But this was from the standpoint of a European perspective, that Europeans had so saturated or so filled out the western frontier that it could no longer be argued with any seriousness that a frontier still existed. Now, this became a really important moment for a lot of Americans. And for Turner, he saw this as a moment that was part cause for celebration, but also cause for concern and anxiety about what the future would hold for the United States. You see, for Turner, he believed that it was the frontier experience. It was the experience of Americans moving westward across the plains of North America that had taught Americans how to be Americans. And what I mean by this is that there were certain skills and characteristics that came from domesticating or taming the American West. I mean, perhaps another way of saying this is that the frontier for Turner was not a place so much as it was a process. It was a process of becoming. Now, these words, some are covered up by my picture here, but the words are democracy, individualism, self-sufficiency, and independence. For Turner, the process of spilling out onto the western plains, settling homesteads, raising animals, raising crops, relying on oneself and maybe a small community of neighbors in a rural setting was a key to what it meant to be an American. Other parts of the world, very few other parts of the world, had this laboratory of a western frontier to teach them how to become a new and different kind of people. This type of thinking that Turner put forth was something that we've wrestled with ever since, this idea that perhaps there's something about Americans or North Americans that is exceptional. There's like a difference. There's something different in our water. There's something different in our character. But for Turner, he would say, there's nothing about Americans that is exceptional. It's the experience of being an American that has made us exceptional. And that experience is one that has come from settling and learning the traits of American democracy and self-reliance with the help of the Western frontier. Now, you can reject this, and a good many people do. But nonetheless, it's important to note that even today, in the politics of our country, there is this idea about American exceptionalism, and many politicians embrace that concept wholeheartedly. In fact, you would have a tough time winning the nomination of the Republican Party if you were not willing to embrace the idea that Americans are exceptional. You'd probably have a difficult time actually winning the Democratic nomination as well, but you'd have a far more difficult time winning the Republican nomination. So anyway, this idea of exceptionalism visited with a real important oomph. It was sort of a blow to the stomach of many Americans. And the question immediately became, well, if the frontier has closed, if the population of North America in the United States is such that there's no longer a frontier, then what do we do? How do we keep teaching Americans how to be Americans? And there were a number of different ideas that went up, and perhaps it's no surprise that it's about this time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, that we see an explosion in athletics, collegiate athletics and professional athletics, whether it's baseball, college football, boxing. A lot of sports come into view at about this time. In part, I'll repeat, it was to offset the loss of this rugged laboratory for learning how to become tough, resilient, self-reliant. And of course, sports promised a little bit of that. Teddy Roosevelt, who also came along at this time, believed that one of the ways the United States could remain tough and firm and individualistic and self-sufficient was through competing and participating in wars. And that was part of his argument as he played a role in leading the United States into the Spanish-Cuban-American War starting in 1898. So this is important, and my question that I would want you to think about is, are you persuaded by this thesis? Does it seem to get at the heart of this sort of interesting idea about what it means to be an American? Granted, there are lots of things going on in the human geography of North America, but this is among them. So what do you find convincing about this? What do you think it overlooks? And here's the Great Plains. I'll just repeat, right down there in the middle of that line between the yellow and the blue is roughly the 100th meridian, whereas roughly where precipitation drops off. To the right, you have greater than 20 inches of precipitation a year. To the left, you have less, and you can see that agriculture becomes pretty difficult in that arid western environment. Okay, so let me just close by talking a little bit about in Canada, because I've sort of given it short shrift. There's been some interesting scholarship, and I'll just highlight one piece of it. In Canada, this whole idea of exceptionalism, and one of the ways that people have talked about exceptionalism, one of the ways that the United States anyway, and to some degree North America, but especially the United States, is that we tend to be a more violent culture than many other world cultures. So we're a little bit more of a violent world region. And even comparing the United States and Canada, we have about 3 times the homicide rate in the United States than that which exists in Canada. And some folks have sought to argue the difference being the way in which the western frontier of the United States was settled compared to that in Canada. And part of what's going on, as I mentioned in class, Canada moves west a few decades after the United States, so that's part of it. But also the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were actually in place. So there was law and authority in the western reaches of Canada before there was in the United States. And some have said because there wasn't the history of self-justice, since it wasn't quite as significant in Canada as it was in the United States, self-justice meaning like vigilantism, that Canada was perhaps spared more of a sort of violent past or a violent identity, cultural identity. And one of the studies that has been going on here is noting the incidence of violence through time based on the distance in the West, in the Canadian West, on the prairie. The farther one was from Mountie forts, the more likely they were to participate in violent crime. And if you ask me about it at the beginning of class tomorrow, I'll talk about an interesting study involving hockey players in Canada today. All right. So thanks for that. We'll see you tomorrow.